You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Late night bites with friends? Already hard to beat. That first too hot bite of fries you couldn't wait for, followed by ice cold Pepsi. Now that hits different. Suddenly, the energy kicks back in, the night goes longer, and the laughs don't stop. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
Hi, Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. Are you looking for a beach read this summer? May I suggest your big wireless bill? It's got suspense, mystery, a slightly flat, emotional arc, and a shocking twist where you realize you've been overpaying the entire time. Fortunately, though, Mint's story is better. Every plan, $15 a month, even unlimited. That's it. Happy ending, zero tears. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
Madame Helena Blavatsky stole nearly every idea she ever had. As I spoke about in my recent series on spiritualism and mediumship, it was discovered after her death that she had plagiarized much of her quintessential work, Isis Unveiled. But her cosmology, her theory of the spiritual evolution of mankind through distinct root races, came later, after she had been exposed as a fraudulent medium in her final book, The Secret Doctrine. She claimed this book, like her first, had been channeled while in a trance, a handy way to skirt plagiarism allegations. But just in case that wasn't enough, she also, somewhat contradictorily, claimed that much of the work was based on a mysterious book she had once seen in Tibet, called the Book of Jian, which does not appear to have been a real book. She said it had been written in Atlantis, in a language called Sinzar, a language never spoken or reproduced by her, about which there exists no archaeological evidence. But much of the claims in her book, that previous to the current iteration of humanity there existed preceding civilizations on the lost continents of Hyperborea, Lemuria, and Atlantis, can easily be traced to known works of her era. Most of her cosmology can be found in the work of French astronomer and revolutionary Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who at a certain point in his career devoted himself to antiquarianism and speculation on pseudo-history. He wrote about Atlantis, the very famous story told in antiquity by Plato about a civilization lost to natural disaster. And he attempted to link it with Greek legends about Hyperborea, a legendary northern land, and Ultima Thule, the metaphorical land of furthest distance from the civilized world. Bailly argued that his Hyperborean Atlantis was the quote-unquote root civilization from which all science and art had originated, and that the remnants of these people were the Brahma gods of Hinduism who had founded Indian civilization. Bailly's ideas proved not only to be a major influence on Blavatsky's theosophy, but also led, perhaps more than Blavatsky's own contributions, to the development of the Aryan myth and Nazi racialist ideology. But perhaps more interesting than Blavatsky's obvious cribbing from Bailly was her use of the legend of Lemuria, which was far more recent than the legends of Hyperborea or Atlantis. In referring to the lost continent of Lemuria, she was not playing with some ancient mythology, as she typically did, but rather she was incorporating some very modern pseudoscience into her cosmology. Lemuria came into existence in 1864, when a zoologist named Philip Sclater discovered lemurs in both India and Madagascar, and therefore theorized that there must once have been a land bridge connecting those places that had since sunk into the ocean. The idea was taken up by some in the scientific community, like Ernst Haeckel, a taxonomist and eugenicist who promoted a lot of scientific racism, to suggest that rather than Africa serving as the cradle of life, perhaps this lost continent of Lemuria could explain some missing links in Darwinian evolution. Some in India connected this theoretical Lemuria to the Tamil legend of Kumari Kandam, a lost landmass south of the Indian subcontinent. As for Blavatsky, she said Lemuria was Australia. But as it turns out, much like other lost continent myths, Lemuria had just been dreamt up, and any reason to believe in it was replaced by knowledge of plate tectonics and continental drift. It is therefore clear as ever that Blavatsky was just cobbling together pseudoscience, myth, and fiction to fabricate an impressive-seeming belief system. In fact, the same critic who had demonstrated that Blavatsky was guilty of plagiarism in her first book was working on demonstrating that she had simply plagiarized most of the secret doctrine as well, from the popular pseudo-history Atlantis, the Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly. Unfortunately, his further exposure of her work would never be published, also because of plate tectonics, in that all of his notes and writings were destroyed in the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake. Despite Blavatsky's numerous exposures as a fraud, those who came after Blavatsky doubled down, such as William Scott Elliott, who wrote theosophical books about both Atlantis and Lemuria after Blavatsky's death. Today, outside of theosophy, and besides a certain strange set of mystical beliefs that the survivors of the lost continent now live on Mount Shasta in California, claims about the lost continent of Lemuria have almost entirely subsided. But claims about Atlantis may never go away. As I demonstrated in Part 1, the lost continent of Atlantis, like Lemuria, never existed, but it has inspired a far longer-lived legend with far deeper lore, in large part because the fiction has been kept alive by those who have used it as the foundation for fictions of their own devising. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I too find the Atlantis story to be the perfect story to prove my points and support my own worldview. Mine are about the ubiquity and persistence of false beliefs. Thank you for listening to the Atlantis Fantasy, Part 2, A Convenient Fiction. Before we continue, I want to thank my newest Patreon contributors, Daniel Leifer, Owen Kerr, Michael Carnival, and generous Premier Tier patron, Jason Britson. Thanks for answering my hopeful call for more support. As it turns out, it's really needed right now, as not only has my own academic career taken a downturn, but the other earner in my family was just laid off by corporate overlords who favor using AI rather than employing human beings. I understand if listeners can't pledge support in this economy, but if you can, it materially helps my family. And you get more historical blindness. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long. And they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my series on spiritualism, I posted a 16-minute episode on a genius scientist and the young girl who duped him into thinking she could manifest a famous spirit called Katie King. And after the first part of this series on Atlantis, I produced another of almost the same length, examining the myths of the Amazons and the lost city of Troy, which Plato also mentions, exploring the extent to which archaeologists consider these myths to be proven real, and why this is no reason to think Atlantis might likewise be proven true. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. In Part 1, in my effort to judge whether those closest to Plato's time took his story of Atlantis as fact or fiction, I spoke about the unsupported notion that Aristotle disbelieved the story and the mistranslation that led to the unsupported claim that Crantor of Soli not only credited the tale but had independently confirmed it in Egypt. Not only is there no strong reason to believe Crantor visited Egypt or confirmed by any means the truth of Plato's Atlantis tale, there's not even evidence that he really credited the story as history beyond Proclus's assertions that he did several hundred years later. Not only does the late date of Proclus's writing and the lack of any extant source material from Crantor trouble his claims, but so too does his agenda, and we will find this to be the case for nearly every writer who defended the Atlantis story as history since it was invented. Strangely, Proclus, like other Neoplatonists, did not take Plato's creation account in the Timaeus literally, yet he argued that the Atlantis account was literal. Some scholars of ancient Greek philosophy, such as Elias Tempelis and Christos Teresis, in their 2018 paper The Metaphysical Connotations of the Atlantis Myth, according to the Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus, have suggested that presenting Atlantis as historical allowed Proclus to argue that the truths of transcendent reality can be reflected in the real-life goings-on of the sensible world, in that the war between the supposedly very real Atlanteans and primeval Greeks could be seen as reflecting some universal conflicts and rivalries. So much like Plato before him, who imagined the Atlantean conflict as an allegory that was just more effective if it was presented as real rather than allegorical, Proclus too went to great lengths to argue, counter to the prevailing view of his time, that Atlantis was real, that Crantor had thought so, and also that another writer, one Marcellus, had written about it in a work titled Ethiopica. To further cast doubt on Proclus's claims, no other writer or work ever discovered has mentioned any work about Atlantis called Ethiopica, and no one is sure who this Marcellus was that Proclus cites. If it were a true work, then by its title alone, we might imagine it was itself a work of fiction. For example, there is thought to be a lost epic of ancient Greece, a companion to the works of Homer, often attributed to Artinus of Miletus, called the Aethiopis, which is believed to focus more on the mythical Amazons in the Trojan War. For more on just how mythical the Amazons were, pledge on Patreon and listen to my latest exclusive episode there. Likewise, another ancient Greek work called the Ethiopica by Heliodorus of Emesa is also a work of fiction, a novel in the style of Homer, but not versified. Judging from these works, it might be presumed the supposed work by this Marcellus fellow, if it was real, was just fiction, playing with Plato's idea. There's good reason to believe that poetic works were circulating in Proclus's time, presenting the story of Atlantis in fictional detail. Works that afterward may have fooled writers into thinking the story of Atlantis was more historically attested than it really was. According to Porphyry of Tyre, in the 3rd century CE, a poet named Zodicus, a student of the father of Neoplatonism, Plotinus, had adapted Plato's Atlantikos Logos, or story about Atlantis, into poetry. Perhaps the work by Marcellus that Proclus cited was similar to this lost work, simply a later piece of fiction inspired by the Atlantis story. Proclus was not the first writer to assert that Atlantis was real, and to rely on works of fiction or even made-up sources to support the claim. In the middle of the 1st century CE, hundreds of years after Plato and hundreds more before Proclus, Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian from Sicily, compiled his monumental Bibliotheca Historica, or Library of History, in which he gives a detailed account of another war supposedly fought by, quote, the Atlanteans who dwell on the coast of the ocean, end quote. But the account of his Atlanteans differs in several respects. They appear to live in North Africa rather than on an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles. and they took their name from Mount Atlas, at the base of which they made their home. The story of these Atlanteans is part of a larger account, said to be an ancient North African, or as he would call it, Libyan history about the Amazon warrior women who made war on the Atlanteans and then joined forces with them to fight the Gorgons. Again, listen to my latest patron exclusive on Patreon for more about the Amazon myth. But the mention here of both Amazon warrior women and Gorgons probably gives a sense that this is mythology more than history. While the Gorgons are depicted here by Diodorus Siculus not as the snake-haired petrifying monsters of mythology, but rather as another nation of powerful women like the Amazons, the instinct to distrust this is valid. Diodorus Siculus was known to simply compile unverified accounts in his histories. He stripped the stories of mythological and supernatural elements, but nevertheless treated all the figures in them as real and all the mythological locations as literal places on Earth. In this passage, he actually names a source, a 2nd century BCE Alexandrian poet, Dionysius, who had been called Scytobrachion, of the leathern arm, because of how prolific his writing was. This poet was known to write fictional accounts based on known mythology, taking a euhemerist perspective in that he portrayed the gods of Olympus and other larger-than-life heroes and creatures simply as normal humans in the distant past, and setting many of his stories in Libya, even if the myths he derived them from were set elsewhere. So we have a prolific author of fiction who took Plato's legend of Atlantis and more myths about Amazons and Gorgons and mixed them all up, rewriting them as more realistic stories. And a century later, we have Diodorus Siculus rehashing that content as if it were real history. And still, not a shred of evidence that Atlantis existed before Plato dreamed it up. Less than 100 years later, in the 1st century CE, Strabo wrote Geographica, appealing to the claims of polymath Posidonius, not Aristotle, as is often thought, to argue that Atlantis might have been real. Like these other works, we must take Strabo's word on his sources, since whatever work he says Posidonius wrote that discusses Atlantis no longer exists. And anyway, as Strabo himself says, Posidonius only admitted that, quote, it is possible that the story about the island of Atlantis is not a fiction, end quote. A statement that by itself seems to suggest it is also possible, or perhaps even more likely, that it is a fiction. Strabo, like Proclus after him, invokes the idea that Atlantis was real only, it seems, in service of his thesis. In his work, he is largely critiquing and correcting the work of previous geographers and natural philosophers. In this passage, he is critical of Posidonius, but he likes Posidonius's argument that Atlantis might have been real because it helps to prove that, quote, the Earth sometimes rises and undergoes settling processes and undergoes changes that result from earthquakes and the other similar agencies, end quote. Of course, he need not argue that a fiction is fact to support this claim, but this, as we'll see, was one of the major reasons why later thinkers raised the story of Atlantis as if it were true. During those same years, Hellenistic Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria wrote his work De Aeternitate Mundi, on the eternity of the world, and used the Atlantis myth as an example to refute a Stoic idea about the Earth being destructible. The Stoics pointed to the emergence of new islands to argue that there was a, quote, diminution of the sea, end quote, all in support of a notion that the Earth has a life cycle, is periodically destroyed, and is reborn. Philo says no, the Earth is eternal, and rather than a dying out of the oceans, the emergence of new islands is owing to Earth's ever-changing nature. He gives examples, like Sicily, which at the time was believed to have once been joined to the mainland, but turned into an island through an inundation of waters. An interesting example, given we've already entertained the idea that Plato had Sicily in mind when imagining Atlantis. And then Philo offers Atlantis as a further example of Earth changes and rising rather than diminishing seas. It is simply a handy example that serves his point. Likewise, in the following century, early Christian apologist Tertullian used both Sicily and Atlantis for the same reasons, but to serve an entirely different purpose. In De Palio, On the Mantle, he argues in defense of his decision to stop wearing a toga and instead wear the humble cloak commonly worn by Greek philosophers. One part of his argument deals with the universality of change. His argument in this passage is, yeah, I've changed my look, but hey, things change. The world changes. Look at Sicily and remember the story of Atlantis? Come the 6th century CE, we find another Christian writer who actually rejects the idea that Atlantis was real because he finds it doesn't support the argument he wants to make. Cosmas the monk, who doesn't actually seem like he was a monk, was a widely traveled merchant marine. He was also called Cosmas Indicoplephtus, Indian voyager, for he had traveled all the way to India, mapped its trade ports, and reported on the Christian communities there. In his important work, Christian Topography, he argues in favor of a flat Earth, and it is for this reason that he takes issue with Plato's Atlantis. He believes in the great encircling sea, not in any, quote, earth which lies beyond the ocean, end quote. Therefore, he calls it, quote, a most manifest invention. For as he could not point out the island, he gave out that God had consigned it to a watery grave, end quote. Cosmas's argument in favor of a flat earth has contributed somewhat to the historiographical legend of the medieval Dark Ages and the false notion that flat earth cosmogony was more widely believed in the Middle Ages than it really was. Cosmas was actually a fringe thinker in this regard, and his notion that the earth was a flat rectangle and the heavens stood above it like the tabernacle of Moses was never embraced by any branch of the Catholic Church. As for his views on Atlantis, it is interesting that Cosmas actually offers an alternative theory regarding the inspiration of Plato's story. He says the story of Atlantis's conquering kings had been stolen from the lost histories of Babylon, written by 3rd century BCE writer Berosus, who described 10 kings among the Chaldeans before a great deluge. And then he said that both the Atlantis story and Berosus's Chaldean history are just distorted versions of Moses' telling of antediluvian history, from Adam to Noah. This shows that writers have been trying to guess what inspired the Atlantis story for centuries, though Cosmas's theory doesn't hold water. Plato never mentions 10 kings as Cosmas claims, and neither did Moses. Instead, Cosmas suggests the 10 Chaldean kings, a succession of kings over more than 2,000 years, not a confederation of kings, as in the Atlantis story, were derived from the biblical description of the passage of 10 generations. It's a weak theory based on speculation, and he also just shows a poor understanding of the framing of the Atlantis story. He claims that it's told by Timaeus, when in the dialogue it is Critias who tells it. And he describes Timaeus as a philosopher who is praised by Plato, Aristotle, and Proclus, seeming to confuse the fictional character Timaeus of Locri with the later sophist philosopher of the same name, or perhaps just misunderstanding Plato's composition of the dialogue that bears that name and later commentary on that work as praise for a real philosopher named Timaeus. Any way you look at it, Cosmas the monk is not strong support either for the historicity or the fictionality of Atlantis. He was just a flat earther, speculating that everything was plagiarized from Moses' Torah. It's worth noting, before leaving the topic, that modern scholars no longer even believe Moses or any one man wrote the Torah, which, for lack of any material evidence suggesting any part of it is true, is viewed as just a collection of theological myths. One of the reasons that the idea of a medieval Dark Age is now rejected by scholars, besides the fact that classical knowledge and traditions were preserved by monastic scribes, and there were sporadic cultural renaissances occurring in Europe during that time, such as in the Byzantine and Carolingian empires, is the fact that elsewhere in the world, great progress and advancements were made. This was true in China as well as in the Mideast and North Africa, in the Islamic Golden Age. Indeed, we can thank Arab and Islamic cultures for preserving, translating, and later transmitting the works of Greek philosophy to the world, as well as works of Greek, Roman, and Persian geography. So in large part, the later chapters of the story of Atlantis are owed to the Islamic Golden Age, as during the Renaissance, this preserved classical thought came again into vogue, and during the Age of Exploration, Western European mariners sailed the world's seas with the ancient maps of Claudius Ptolemy in hand and the legends of ancient and classical Greece in mind. Therefore, we find explorers expecting to discover the Fortunate Isles of Hesiod, or perhaps the remnants of Plato's drowned Atlantis out in the great wide Atlantic. And on the alien lands they discovered, they expected to find the dog-headed men and headless men of ancient Greek stories. After Columbus navigated to the Americas, explorers looked for these legends here. Francisco de Orellana, during his conquests of South America, encountered a tribe whose women fought fiercely alongside their men, and he therefore named the river by which the tribe lived the Amazon. Later in the 16th century, Francisco López de Gomara, in his Historia General de las Indias, became the first to suggest that the New World really was Plato's Atlantis, pointing out that in the Nahuatl language, Atl, A-T-L, means water. Never mind that Plato himself clarified the name Atlantis derived from the name of the Titan Atlas, a word deriving from the Greek word for bearer. Spanish historians Agustín de Zárate and Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa took it further, speculating about how far the Americas might have stretched toward Europe, perhaps even connecting to them, before the sinking of a great part of it, and into what lands the ancient Atlanteans may have fled. Bartolomé de las Casas suggested that the archipelago of the Antilles was all that could still be discerned of the sunken portion of it. Soon, the designations Insula Atlantica and Atlantis Insula started showing up on early maps of the Americas. Perhaps the most famous of these was drawn in the 17th century by polymath Athanasius Kircher, and purports to show the actual sunken landmass right in the center of the Atlantic between Africa and the Americas. The map is nothing but fantasy, though, just as the story always was. The Jesuit scholar Kircher, whose work in geology and microbiology was important, is remembered today as, quote, more charlatan than savant, end quote, in René Descartes' estimation. In the midst of the Age of Enlightenment, Kircher preferred magical thinking. He believed in a hollow earth and wrote a whole book about the demons, giants, dragons, and little green men that populated it. He curated a museum in which he claimed to display a brick from the Tower of Babel and the skeleton of a mermaid, making him a kind of 17th century P.T. Barnum. He also claimed to have deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs, the understanding of which had by that time been long lost. It turns out he was totally wrong. In short, his belief in Atlantis and detailed map of its location does more to discredit the story than to support its factuality. After his third voyage, as he entered the twilight of his years, Christopher Columbus wrote a manuscript called Book of Prophecies, in which he expounded on some of the more apocalyptic religious views that had always driven him. Among assertions about the need to spread Christianity worldwide and take back the Holy Land to hasten the second coming of Christ. He also wrote about the imminent rediscovery of paradise in the New World. While other explorers looked for the mythical island of Atlantis in the New World, Columbus looked for the mythical Eden of the Bible, and as I've discussed before, he thought it might be found in Venezuela. Some Renaissance thinkers afterward began to syncretize this thought, imagining the perfect society, an earthly paradise, as an island like Atlantis, somewhere in the New World. The first was Thomas More, whose work Utopia followed very much the framing narrative of Plato's Atlantis story. First of all, it's framed as a dialogue between More and some friends, who meet a traveler who thereafter describes to them the perfect society he encountered on an island in the New World. Much like Plato, More seems to be using his imagined civilization to make a point. And indeed, many scholars of literature count Plato's dialogues, The Republic, and Laws among the first pieces of utopian literature, a genre and theme that takes its name from More's book. But like Plato's Atlantis story, the satire of More's novel is often misunderstood. Just as Plato's Atlantis is described as wealthy and orderly and advanced, but corrupted, More's Utopia is described as progressive in some regards, but repressive in others, more authoritarian than any truly perfect society. Unlike Plato, More's allegory makes it far more clear that the author is simply engaging in a thought experiment, with the fictional traveler's name meaning peddler of nonsense, and the name of the island itself, the titular Utopia, meaning, quote, no place, end quote. Among the utopian novels of the next century, one that stands out as making its inspiration in the Atlantis story clear is Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, which likewise depicts a seemingly perfect society on an island in the New World, where science and reason reign supreme. Like More's Utopia, Bacon's island society also is flawed in that it is ruled by a powerful elite who wield authoritarian control over all. But while it's still debatable whether More really intended his utopia to be viewed as perfect or as a warning, in Bacon's case, he really didn't seem to realize the shortcomings of the society he was presenting as ideal. Now for a brief intermission.
The perfect lunch combo. That first bite of your favorite sub, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Add a couple of friends, and now that's next level. Suddenly, the laughs get louder, the stories keep flowing, and the food tastes better. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today. The perfect lunch combo. That first bite of your favorite sub, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Add a couple of friends, and now that's next level. Suddenly, the laughs get louder, the stories keep flowing, and the food tastes better. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today. The perfect lunch combo. That first bite of your favorite sub, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Add a couple of friends, and now that's next level. Suddenly, the laughs get louder, the stories keep flowing, and the food tastes better. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today. The perfect lunch combo. That first bite of your favorite sub, followed by ice-cold Pepsi. Add a couple of friends, and now that's next level. Suddenly, the laughs get louder, the stories keep flowing, and the food tastes better. Because Pepsi brings out more flavor, more fun, and more of the moment. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a Pepsi Zero Sugar today.
Now, back to the show. In the following century, as more was learned about the ancient indigenous cultures of the Americas, the racist notion emerged that the native peoples of the Americas could not possibly have developed their civilization independently. It began with speculation about the origins of indigenous American cultures being traceable to biblical peoples. Some said that they were the lost tribes of Israel, a view that would prove popular all the way through the 19th century, when Joseph Smith would make it a founding legend of his Mormon church. Others said they had migrated to the Americas from the Middle East after the construction of the Tower of Babel, and the confusion of languages. Still others suggested that they were descended from one of Noah's sons after the flood, specifically Japheth, who was also popularly believed to have been the progenitor of European peoples. And how did these migrations occur? The land bridge theory that the ancient ancestors of indigenous Americans had crossed from Asia via Beringia was slowly developing and gaining currency, but many presumed that the inhabitants of the New World had traveled there across Atlantis. These notions persisted into the 19th century, when French clergyman and ethnographer Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg built on them. During his researches into the Maya civilization, he concluded that the ancient Mayan language was related to European and Persian languages, that their architecture reflected Greek and Roman styles, and that their mythology was derived from the same source as Egyptian mythology. His working theory then was that all major civilizations had descended from Atlantis, a lost precursor civilization. However, his entire theory hinged on not only Atlantis being real, which I think we've established it was not, but also on a flawed understanding of Mayan hieroglyphs and a series of unsupported leaps in reasoning based only on speculation. That's why, when his works were published, he was considered by contemporary scholars to be a pseudo-archaeologist and pseudo-historian. Nevertheless, his work proved to be a major juncture and articulation point in the spread of the story of Atlantis. He single-handedly became the father of both hyperdiffusionism and Mayanism, the New Age belief that the Maya possessed special spiritual insight and esoteric knowledge that has now become lost. I've spoken many times before about hyperdiffusionism and its white supremacist lies. For more on the topic, listen to my episode on the myth of a lost mound builder race, my two-parter on the abode of the lost tribes of Israel, and its follow-up, written in stone, the archaeological frauds of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact theories, as well as my long series, Pyramidiacy. Especially relevant is my patron exclusive, The Racism of Hyperdiffusionists, which Patreon supporters can easily find in my Blind Spots collection, and others can purchase for $3, which is the minimum price I have to charge. In broad strokes, de Bourbourg's claims would afterward be taken up by 49er, amateur antiquarian, and early photographer Augustus Le Plongeon, who carried his torch by publishing photos of Maya artifacts from excavations across the Yucatan, and adding the further layer that not just culture and ancient knowledge, but also Freemasonry had spread, not from Atlantis outward, but rather from the Maya to Atlantis and thence to Egypt and the world. From a mistranslation of de Bourbourg's, he determined that Atlantis was actually called Mu. You may have heard of another mythical lost continent called Mu, but it was all Atlantis theorizing by these guys. Later, Mu would be transplanted into the Pacific and identified with the equally made-up Lemuria, but Le Plongeon had it in the Atlantic and even made up entire mythological narratives about it, complete with royal lineages and romance stories. Evidence that the ancient Egyptian civilization actually preceded Maya civilization discredited the claims of hyperdiffusionists like de Bourbourg and Le Plongeon. But late in the 19th century, Ignatius Donnelly, a retired Minnesota populist politician looking for an exciting topic of research, ended up bringing it all together. I've spoken about Donnelly and his pseudo-histories before as well, in some of the aforementioned episodes and in my series on the Shakespeare authorship question. Since, like many another pseudo-historian since him, after running one false claim into the ground, he championed another. But he's most famous for his first book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which after Plato's Timaeus and Critias stands as the most important work in the modern Atlantis myth. In it, he identifies Atlantis as Eden and the cataclysm that sank it as the biblical flood, and its kings and queens as the gods and goddesses of ancient mythology. as evidence that the inhabitants of Atlantis fled their drowning home to Egypt, Western Europe, and the New World, he recycles de Bourbourg's and Laplangeon's work. Inspired by the recent Lemuria theories, Donnelly added some further quote-unquote evidence based on the similarity of certain animal species between continents. But all of that is explained by evolutionary divergence of species, migration on land bridges, and continental drift. Facts that also, of course, disprove the rest of the Atlantis myth. Donnelly not only stitched together the early pseudo-archaeological claims of lost continents and hyperdiffusionism, he also brought in the notion of Atlantis as a utopia, equating it with paradise, and attributing all major developments of civilization and technology to them. Here we see the basic racism of hyperdiffusionism on display. It perpetuates the pernicious falsehood that indigenous cultures could not have achieved anything, robbing them of their history, and attributing it instead to some mysterious bringer of culture who civilized the primitives. It is a quintessentially colonialist viewpoint, and at its heart is white supremacism. Indeed, Donnelly, like many another hyperdiffusionist and Atlantis theorist after him, asserted that the superior Atlanteans were fair-skinned, and that their descendants have been quote-unquote mongrelized by interbreeding with dark-skinned inferior peoples, thereby contributing to the racial myth of a superior white precursor civilization. All of this, along with Jean-Sylvain Bailly's Hyperborea claims, the Lemuria theory, and the spiritualist writings of Mayanism proponents like Godfrey Higgins, greatly inspired Helena Blavatsky in her inventions of the mythos behind theosophy. Interestingly, she portrayed the Atlanteans not as the fair-skinned forerunners of Europeans, but rather as the olive-skinned ancestors of indigenous Americans and Mongolians. Nevertheless, her claim that this Atlantean quote-unquote root race was lower or less evolved than the current quote-unquote Aryan root race remains racist, even though she didn't mean white when she used the term Aryan, but rather included Hindus and Persians and numerous other ethnic groups with a variety of skin colors. It remained racist because she was excluding Mongolian and indigenous American peoples from what she portrayed as the new level of spiritual evolution, saying they were the remnants of an inferior race. So certainly, it's easy to see how Blavatsky's occult spin on New Age Mayanism and Donnelly's hyperdiffusionism contributed to the development of the Aryan myth and Nazi racial ideology. Historian and expert on pseudo-history Ronald Fritz has called the Atlantis myth the, quote, mother of pseudo-history, end quote. Indeed, it seems the topic of Atlantis is like a spider web, connecting to so many pseudo-historical topics I've discussed in the past. Case in point, it connects clearly to the Aryan myth, and this too is not a new topic for me. I spoke about the Aryan myth way back in 2019 in part 1 of my series on Nazi occultism, and I've had reason occasionally to bring it up again since then. To review, in the 1600s, a Dutch linguist named Boxhorn first proposed that many European and Asian languages derived from a common ancestor language, which he called Scythian. This was the birth not only of the Proto-Indo-European language theory, but also of comparative linguistics generally. In the 1700s, English philologist William Jones took this linguistic theory further to suggest that an Indo-European race once invaded India. He called them Aryans, using an honorific term once used by the Indo-Iranian authors of Vedic texts to differentiate themselves as pure and noble above other castes of people. The idea, which was picked up from Jones in later years, was that these Indo-Iranians differentiated themselves as a racial caste, and Vedic references to skin color as a differentiator meant they were an invading race. Today, scholars agree that the differentiation was cultural and linguistic, not racial. But what developed from Jones's hypothesis was the idea of light-skinned, light-haired, light-eyed ancient invaders of India whose language is related to European languages. This myth of an Aryan precursor race probably would not have flourished and spread and done so much harm in the following centuries if it didn't mesh so well with the simultaneous rise of lost continent myths, since it could be claimed those lost lands were the real homes of the mythical Aryans. The early Hyperborean Atlantis hypothesis of Jean-Sylvain Bailly that I spoke about at the top of this episode, in particular found an audience in Germany. And in the early 19th century, a German Indologist, Friedrich Schlegel, drew comparisons between Indo-Iranian words and German words, thereby forging a dubious connection specifically between these imagined Aryans and Germanic peoples, an identification that would continue to be developed and reinforced by German nationalist archaeologists like Gustav Kosina until it became widely believed in early 20th century Germany that Aryan was synonymous with German. In the late 19th century, as the myth of Atlantis as a culture bringer entered the discourse, from de Bourbourg and Le Plongeon and Ignatius Donnelly, the Atlantis myth seemed to coalesce with the Aryan myth, which likewise had developed into a myth about a supposedly more advanced people invading and civilizing indigenous peoples. Helena Blavatsky's writings, which emphasized the idea of not only root races, but also racial evolution and hierarchy, certainly may be argued to have contributed in material ways to Nazi racial ideology, even if she did not claim that Atlanteans were white and described the quote-unquote Aryan root race as the current stage of human evolution, composed of diverse physical types and racial characteristics. Her theosophy became very popular in Germany at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. In fact, one German theosophist, Rudolf Steiner, who speculated a great deal about Atlantis and Lemuria in his own writings, ended up founding his own cult mystical group, the Anthroposophical Society. Today, anthroposophy, a word meaning the wisdom of mankind, is mostly relevant as the origin of Waldorf education, one of the most popular forms of alternative education in the world. But theosophy also birthed another cult movement in early 20th century Germany, Ariosophy, the quote-unquote wisdom of the Aryans. And this movement embraced not only the idea of Germans as Aryans, but also of Aryans as superior. They embraced the swastika as well, a Sanskrit symbol used in Hinduism and Buddhism that Blavatsky had popularized in theosophy. Ariosophists believed it a symbol of the ancient Aryans. Ariosophy was an explicitly occult movement, like theosophy. In fact, the term is used as something of an umbrella to refer to numerous mystical and occult groups and schools of thought in the German counterculture at the time, such as the Armanism of Guido von List, the theozoology of Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, and extreme right-wing secret societies like the Order of the New Templars, the Germanen Order, and the Thule Society. It was from this mystical counterculture that belief in Edward Bulwer-Lytton's Vril arose, and claims that Karl Schappeler's phony device could harness this all-encompassing space energy were published, as discussed in my recent series on the myths of Nazi supertechnology and my patron exclusive on the Schappeler device. Unlike theosophy, Ariosophy was uniquely German in its focus and political ideology. It was obsessed with Teutonic and Nordic myth, fascinated by Scandinavian and Germanic rune alphabets, and consumed with anti-Semitism. These groups overlapped with the ethno-nationalist Völkisch movement and represent the roots of fascism in Nazi Germany. Indeed, Heinrich Himmler, head of the paramilitary SS security force, one of the most powerful Nazis in the party and a principal organizer and overseer of the Holocaust, was himself an acolyte of Ariosophy. He and other Nazis, even those who did not subscribe to this brand of occultism, largely believed that the German people were descended from a master race that originated from Atlantis, and Himmler sought to prove it. The majority of the research and expeditions he organized in his Ahnenerbe group were tasked with finding evidence to prove this Aryan Atlantean ancestral heritage. They mounted pseudo-archaeological expeditions to Tibet, Iceland, Antarctica, and South America, searching for material evidence to prove their Atlantean extraction and therefore their superiority. All of this is why modern purveyors of Atlantis claims, people like Graham Hancock and his collaborators and amplifiers like Joe Rogan, who further promote hyperdiffusionist claims like Ignatius Donnelly's today, must be criticized, not just for spreading pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology, but also for spreading racist claims. At the heart of the Atlantis myth today is a fundamental racism. It's one of the main reasons why it was resurrected in the colonial era and why it has persisted through the 20th century, because it served the racist purposes of those who promoted it. And there's a further purpose that it served then and continues to serve today, to enchant the dupes of mystic grifters. It started with Blavatsky and the wool veil she pulled over her followers' eyes. It continued not only with all the mystical nonsense of Ariosophy, but with Rudolf Steiner as well, who claimed to be mentally accessing Blavatsky's Akashic record when he wrote about Atlantis and Lemuria. And we see this tradition continued in America by the clairvoyant Edgar Cayce, in whose career we see the influence of everything I've been talking about lately, from mesmerism to spiritualism to theosophy and claims about Atlantis. Cayce started as a medical clairvoyant, claiming the ability to supernaturally diagnose and eventually heal people. Like many mediums, he got into the field after seeing someone else do it. He claimed to have lost his voice and had it restored through hypnotic suggestion by a vaudeville stage hypnotist named Hart the Laugh King, who rather seems to have been more of a comedian, with newspapers calling him the, quote, merry monarch of mirth, end quote. Nevertheless, Cayce became obsessed with the idea that while in a hypnotic trance, people could perform clairvoyant feats. And soon he was teaming up with a homeopath and claiming he himself had such powers, that he, quote, told wonderful truths while he was asleep, end quote, as his partner told newspapers. In their sessions, Cayce would lie down, cross his arms, and supposedly fall immediately to sleep, during which slumber he spoke and answered questions with knowledge he could not himself possess, such as a knowledge of anatomy and medical terminology in which he had not been educated. He therefore became known as the Sleeping Prophet, and as his fame grew, some would come to him seeking stock market predictions or locations of hidden treasures, though he never provided them, likely because he couldn't. However, he obliged when he was asked about reincarnation, since whatever he said about people's past lives could not be proven false. He therefore took his readings in a more mystical, metaphysical direction. He eventually began parroting Blavatsky's writing, but like Blavatsky, who claimed not to be plagiarizing but rather channeling lost knowledge, Cayce claimed no knowledge of Blavatsky and instead claimed to be accessing the Akashic record, that store of ancient knowledge that Blavatsky said only Mahatmas and psychic mediums like her and Cayce could access. That's when he began speaking in trance and writing about and later lecturing on Atlantis, which he claimed was under the Bahamas, that Bimini Island was the peak of an Atlantean mountain. Remember that, as we'll discuss it further in the last installment of this series, as we dissect the many claims made by Atlantologists of the actual location of the lost continent of Atlantis. For now, we can very simply and easily dismiss everything Edgar Cayce ever claimed, since he was a clear fraud. His alternative medicine claims are recognized as quackery. His supposed clairvoyant readings were typically riddled with inaccuracies, and his predictions about the future were way off. He claimed Atlantis would rise from the ocean again in the 60s. He said Jesus would return by 1998. And he claimed that major changes to the Earth would occur by the end of the 20th century, resulting in the destruction of major American cities. With those cities still around, there is little reason to credit any of his claims. Yet many of his claims about Atlantis are repeated by copycat grifters today. Claims about Atlantean technology, that they harnessed the power of the sun through crystals, you can hear repeated as though it's fact by channelers and past life regressionists today who claim to be descended from Atlanteans or to have lived there in previous lives, even though the session in which Cayce claimed this also featured his prediction that by the late 50s, America would acquire death ray weapons based on this Atlantean tech. In addition to writers who have appeared on Joe Rogan more than a dozen times to keep the recycled claims of Ignatius Donnelly alive, like Graham Hancock and his collaborator Randall Carlson, there are also mystic hucksters like Billy Carson who promote the most ridiculous magical views of Atlantis on the same program. Carson speaks about the Akashic record and Cayce's supposed access of it as real, about Atlantis and its links with ancient Egypt as detailed in Cayce's trance readings as true, and even asserts its alien origins, another aspect of the Atlantis myth that I've spoken about before, going all the way back to the morning of the magicians and its ideas of ancient astronauts as popularized by Eric von Daniken and discussed in depth in my series Danikenitis. The notion of Atlanteans being aliens has been another thread in this tapestry of nonsense surrounding Plato's allegory. Platformed by Joe Rogan, Billy Carson has presented all of it as true, along with the mid-20th century hoax that I spoke about in my Pyramidiacy series, The Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean, a fake mystical tome written by an American occultist inspired by alchemical lore, theosophy, and H.P. Lovecraft, that claims to detail the history of Atlantis in much the same way others have, as an advanced technological society that survived in ancient Egypt after their continent's destruction. Billy Carson makes of this hoax manuscript the main source of the secrets to which he claims to be privy, as does David Icke, the father of the reptilian conspiracy theory. In the end, Atlantis, the little allegorical story Plato experimented with thousands of years ago and abandoned, really has turned out to be the mother of not only pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology, but also conspiracy theory and claims of the supernatural and misinformation generally. And just as we saw in spiritualism, it has claimed the minds of many educated and otherwise brilliant thinkers who have come to believe, against reason, that it is real, embarking on a lifelong obsessive quest when they believe they have figured out precisely where it used to be, as we'll see next time in the conclusion of this series. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, Chris BDG, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Brian, Jamie Nielsen, Martin Robistow, Josh Haberman, and AJ. Make sure you head over to the Patreon app and complete the poll I posted there before the recent patron-exclusive minisode. I'm hoping to get a clear sense of what the most popular or favorite kind of topic I cover is among you patrons, in an effort to pick the best one I can for the upcoming 10th anniversary of the podcast. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, pseudo-history, pseudo-archaeology, supernatural claims, and conspiracy theory build on each other like some alternative sort of empiricism, creating a feedback loop. False history relies on fringe and distorted archaeological claims as evidence, and gaps in the logic are mortared in with claims of massive cover-up, the paranormal, and aliens. The truth I'm always scratching the surface of is that all the lies are related and even interdependent.
Do you hear that? That sound, right? That means that summer's officially here. It means that grown adults just sprint into the street for a frozen dessert shaped like a cartoon. But this summer, Mint Mobile has a better treat. Every plan, including unlimited, is $15 a month. And unlike ice cream, it won't drip down your wrist or look nothing like the picture. Does anyone have any cash? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. New customer offer for initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
This episode is brought to you by ChatGPT. Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast. Have you guys heard about ChatGPT work? It's the new way to use ChatGPT for bigger multi-step projects. And when you need more than just answers, give ChatGPT work access to your apps and files, and it can create real work documents like spreadsheets, slides, and structured reports. Get started at chatgpt.com by selecting work mode, available on Plus and Pro plans.